Hey there, my name is Grant, and you are watching Historian Essentials, the show where I give a quick, brief explanation about different terminology, concepts, and ideas that history majors should be familiar with. And in this episode, we are looking at primary and secondary sources. The terms primary and secondary source refer to how close a source is to its subject matter. A primary source is something that is close to the subject matter it's talking about. It could be written works like a journal or some kind of document, and it could be an artifact, an individual's testimony, and more so in the modern age, it can be the form of audio or video recordings. When doing original research, a historian should be inclined to using primary sources if available to them. However, not all primary sources are created equal. The people creating a primary source are just as vulnerable to being wrong and biased as anything else. This is why you should always have multiple primary sources for a single subject in order to corroborate the details. Now, sometimes this isn't always available, especially for events further in the past, but if they're available, you should use them. Because there are sometimes problems with primary sources, you should also utilize secondary sources. As mentioned earlier, sometimes primary sources are wrong or have missing details, so a secondary source can correct mistakes in primary sources or put the sources into a greater historical context. A common goal for secondary sources is to take the primary sources that are available and reinterpret them through a new lens. Now, sometimes secondary sources are also not reliable. Sometimes they have bad facts, they use bad primary sources, or sometimes not using sources at all. And so, just like with primary sources, you should use multiple secondary sources to get the facts straight. And most importantly, you shouldn't use either sources uncritically. Now, the line between primary and secondary sources can be kind of blurry sometimes. What constitutes a primary source depends on what you're doing with it. Let's say you're writing a book or paper on the American Revolution. In this circumstance, you could use Thomas Paine's Common Sense or American Crisis as a primary source because it is from the time period. But you couldn't use David McCullough's 1776 because it was published in 2006. However, you could use 1776 as a primary source if you were writing about 21st century perceptions on the American Revolution. This is because your subject isn't the revolution itself, but rather the discourse around the subject. This is commonly done in intellectual histories, which trace the history of ideas development over time. And in that subject field, they commonly use books that would normally be labeled as secondary sources in any other subject, but can be used as primary sources for them. So in review, primary sources are writings, artifacts, and materials that is taken directly from the time period, while secondary sources are presentations of information that have been originally presented somewhere else. Sometimes primary and secondary sources have factual issues, in which case you should check them with other primary and secondary sources. And finally, any source can be a primary source depending on how you're using it. Thanks to Cypher the Cynical Historian for recommending this topic. So what are some other terms and concepts history majors should know? Tell me so down in the comments below. I would like to thank my patrons for making this video possible. Thanks to your support, I can continue to make these videos to educate and entertain. If you're interested in becoming a patron yourself and getting perks such as getting to see videos early or having your name in the end credits, then you can go to patreon.com/GrantHirsch to find out more. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.